Welcome to Myth Vault, the channel where real history is stripped of comfort and the darkest truths are told without mercy. What you are about to hear is not a story created for shock value and not a horror tale invented to scare you. This is a real and documented crime that happened in Germany in 1922 and remains unsolved to this day. On a quiet farm hidden behind forests in Bavaria, 6 people were murdered with deliberate cruelty. They were not attacked by strangers passing through in panic or rage. They were killed slowly, methodically, and with terrifying control using a farming tool taken from their own property. But what truly separates this case from all others is what happened after the murders were complete. For 3 full days, someone stayed inside the farmhouse. They moved freely through rooms filled with dead bodies. They fed the animals outside as if nothing had happened. They cooked food in the kitchen. They burned fuel in the fireplace. They lived among the dead without fear, urgency, or guilt. No neighbors reported screams. No police were called. No one noticed anything wrong until days later. This case is known as the Hinterkaifeck Murders, one of the most disturbing and puzzling crimes in German history. It is a story of isolation, family secrets, ignored warnings, and a killer who was never brought to justice. It is a case filled with strange events that occurred before the murders, disturbing behavior after the murders, and an investigation that failed at every critical moment. Tonight, Myth Vault will guide you through every verified detail of this case. We will explore the farm, the family, the secrets, the night of the murders, the investigation, and the suspects who were never convicted. Every word you hear is grounded in documented history, court records, police files, and credible investigative research. If you are ready to confront a mystery that refuses to die, stay with Myth Vault until the very end. Subscribe to Myth Vault now, because stories like this demand attention, memory, and truth. Hinterkaifeck was not a place where people arrived by accident, because it was deliberately isolated from the outside world. The farmstead was located about 70 kilometers north of Munich, in the Bavarian countryside, hidden behind a small hamlet called Kaifeck and surrounded by dense woodland. The name Hinterkaifeck meant behind Kaifeck, and that name reflected both its physical location and its emotional isolation. Built around 1863, the farm consisted of a main house, a barn, stables, and surrounding farmland. There were no nearby houses, no street lighting, and no quick access to help. At night, darkness covered everything, and silence was broken only by animals and wind moving through trees. Living on this isolated property was the Gruber family, whose outward appearance masked a deeply disturbed and dangerous reality. Andreas Gruber was the head of the household and controlled every aspect of life on the farm. Born in 1858, he was known locally as strict, aggressive, and feared rather than respected. His authority was absolute, and disobedience was not tolerated. His wife, 𝐔𝐍𝐒 Gruber, born in 1849, had already endured a difficult life before arriving at Hinterkaifeck. The farm itself originally belonged to her and came through a divorce settlement from her first marriage, which meant the property carried emotional and legal history long before the murders. Despite this, Andreas maintained full control over the household and its inhabitants. Their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, was born in 1887 and grew up under her father's dominance. In March 1914, she married Karl Gabriel, a young man from a nearby area. On the day of the marriage, ownership of the farm was transferred to the young couple, symbolizing a supposed new beginning. That beginning was short-lived. Only months later, Karl Gabriel was sent to fight in the First World War. In December 1914, he was officially reported killed at the Battle of Arras. His body was never recovered, leaving unanswered questions that would later fuel rumors and suspicion. Only weeks after receiving news of his death, Victoria gave birth to their daughter, 𝐔𝐍𝐒 Gabriel. Instead of healing, grief deepened into scandal. In 1915, a Bavarian court convicted Andreas Gruber and his own daughter Victoria of maintaining an incestuous relationship that had lasted for years. The court ruled that the abuse occurred between 1907 and 1910. Andreas was sentenced to 1 year in prison. Victoria served 1 month. When Andreas returned to the farm after his release, the abuse reportedly continued. This fact would later become central to suspicion and motive. In 1919, Victoria gave birth to a son named Joseph Gruber. She later admitted to a neighbor and romantic partner named Lorenz Schlittenbauer that the child was conceived through continued sexual abuse by her father. Schlittenbauer reported Andreas to authorities, then withdrew his complaint, then testified again. The court failed to convict Andreas due to lack of sufficient evidence. Despite this, Andreas made several incriminating statements during testimony and was denied compensation for pretrial detention. Schlittenbauer agreed to adopt Joseph, further entangling himself in the family's troubled life. By 1922, Hinterkaifeck was a place saturated with tension, resentment, and fear. The household was emotionally unstable, and the surrounding community was aware of its troubled reputation. Strange events began to occur. A former maid named 𝐔𝐍𝐿 𝐒𝐿 quit her job after hearing unexplained footsteps and noises coming from the attic at night. She believed someone was inside the house and felt unsafe remaining there. In the months before the murders, Andreas Gruber himself reported discovering footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farm. There were no footprints leading away. He also found a newspaper from Munich that no one in the area subscribed to. Locks were broken. Footsteps were heard again in the attic. Despite these warnings, Andreas refused offers of help and never contacted the police, according to later testimony. Victoria was seen fleeing the farm one night after a violent argument with her father. She was later found in the forest and returned home. The warnings were there, the fear was present, the danger was visible, but nothing was done, and whatever was watching, waiting, and approaching Hinterkaifeck was allowed to come closer without resistance. The final day at Hinterkaifeck began in a way that did not appear unusual to anyone who might have observed the farm from a distance. Yet the atmosphere inside the property was already heavy with fear, tension, and unspoken dread. For months, strange events had been reported, warnings had been ignored, and a sense of unease had settled deep into the walls of the farmhouse. By the afternoon of Friday, March 31, 1922, the stage had already been set for violence even if the victims themselves could not yet see it. That afternoon, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm to begin her employment. She was 44 years old and had agreed to take the position despite being aware that the household had a troubled reputation. Her sister accompanied her to Hinterkaifeck and remained only briefly before leaving the isolated property and walking back towards safety and normal life. This short visit would later become one of the most haunting details of the case because it marked the last verified moment when any outsider saw the inhabitants of Hinterkaifeck alive. As evening approached, daily routines continued without interruption. The animals were secured in their stalls. The family prepared for the night. No neighbors heard shouting or signs of conflict. The silence of the countryside remained intact. Sometime later that night, the killings began. Investigators later concluded that the victims were likely lured one by one into the barn through the stable area. The precise method used to draw them there has never been definitively established, but restless animals are believed to have played a key role. Given the family's experience with farming life, unusual animal behavior would have immediately demanded attention. Inside the barn, the killer waited. The murder weapon was a mattock, a farming tool that belonged to the household and was normally kept on the property. This detail strongly suggested that the killer was familiar with the farm and its layout. Andreas Gruber is believed to have been attacked first. He was struck in the head with great force. The blow was fatal. His wife 𝐔𝐍𝐿 followed him into the barn and was also killed by repeated blows to the head. Next came Victoria Gabriel, who was struck with the same brutal efficiency. Finally, her 7-year-old daughter 𝐔𝐍𝐿 Gabriel was attacked. The bodies of these 4 victims were later found stacked together in the hay. There was no attempt to hide them completely. Instead, they were placed as if the killer was unconcerned about discovery. Evidence gathered during the autopsy revealed one of the most horrifying aspects of the crime. Young 𝐔𝐍𝐿 Gabriel did not die immediately. She remained alive for several hours after the initial assault. While lying injured in the straw, she tore clumps of her own hair out in agony and terror. This single detail revealed the unimaginable suffering that occurred in that barn while no one came to help. After killing the 4 victims in the barn, the killer did not flee. Instead, they moved calmly into the living quarters of the farmhouse. There was no sign of panic. There was no rush. Inside the house, 2-year-old Josef Gruber was sleeping in his crib. He was killed using the same mattock. The attack ended his life instantly. Maria Baumgartner was then killed in her bed. She had been working at Hinterkaifeck for less than 1 full day. There was no evidence that she had any personal connection to the family's past or its conflicts. Her death appeared to be the result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The murders were exceptionally violent, yet they showed signs of control and deliberation. There were no signs of chaotic struggle. There was no indication that the killings were driven by sudden rage. Valuables were left untouched. Money remained in the house. This eliminated robbery as a primary motive and deepened the mystery surrounding the crime. What happened after the murders is what transformed the Hinterkaifeck case into one of the most disturbing crimes in recorded history. For at least 3 days following the killings, someone remained on the property. This fact was later confirmed by multiple pieces of evidence that could not be explained in any other way. The animals on the farm were fed daily. Anyone familiar with farming life understood that animals required regular care and could not survive for days without attention. The fact that they remained calm and healthy indicated that someone was actively caring for them. Inside the house, food was consumed. Bread from the kitchen was eaten. Meat was cut from the pantry. The fireplace was used. Smoke was later observed rising from the chimney, indicating that the oven had been heated. A passerby reported a foul smell coming from the smoke, suggesting that something unpleasant may have been burned. This report was never properly investigated. The idea that a killer would remain inside a house filled with corpses, eating food and tending animals, introduced a level of psychological horror that few crimes have ever matched. On April 1st, 2 coffee sellers arrived at Hinterkaifeck to take an order. They knocked on the door and received no response. They walked around the property and noticed that the gate to the machine room was open. Despite this unusual detail, they decided to leave without further investigation. Days passed without contact from the family. Young 𝐔𝐍𝐒𝐿 Gabriel failed to attend school without explanation. The Gruber family did not appear for Sunday church. Still, no immediate alarm was raised. On the morning of April 4th, a mechanic named Albert Hoffner arrived at Hinterkaifeck to repair farm equipment. He waited for over an hour without seeing anyone. He proceeded to complete the repair alone on the property and remained there for several hours. At no point did he see any member of the family or notice anything that immediately indicated mass murder. Later that same day, concern finally escalated. Lorenz Schlittenbauer sent his teenage son and stepson to check on the family. They returned reporting that they had seen no one. Schlittenbauer then went to the farm himself, accompanied by neighbors Michael Pohl and Jakob Sigel. They broke into the barn and discovered the bodies of Andreas Gruber, 𝐔𝐍𝐒𝐿 Gruber, Victoria Gabriel, and young 𝐔𝐍𝐒𝐿 Gabriel. Despite the possibility that the killer might still be present, Schlittenbauer entered the farmhouse alone. He unlocked the front door without difficulty. This action would later raise serious suspicion and debate. Inside the house, the bodies of Maria Baumgartner and Josef Gruber were found. The scene confirmed the scale of the tragedy and the failure of early detection. The crime scene was immediately compromised. Onlookers walked freely through the barn and the house. Bodies were touched and moved. Food was prepared in the kitchen. By the time authorities arrived, critical evidence had already been destroyed. Fingerprints were not properly preserved. Key details were lost forever. The killer had vanished. The farm fell silent once more, and Hinterkaifeck became the location of one of the most disturbing and unsolved crimes in history. When authorities finally arrived at Hinterkaifeck, the opportunity to preserve a clean crime scene had already been lost, and this failure would haunt the investigation from the very beginning. Neighbors, relatives, and curious onlookers had walked freely through the barn and the house. Bodies had been touched, moved, and even covered. Meals had been prepared in the kitchen where the killer had eaten days earlier. By the time official investigators began their work, critical evidence had already been destroyed beyond recovery. An investigative team from Munich was assigned to the case, led by Inspector Georg Reingruber. The first task was to establish the cause of death and identify the murder weapon. Autopsies were performed inside the barn itself, a decision that would later be criticized due to the lack of controlled conditions. The examining physician determined that all 6 victims had died from blows to the head inflicted by a heavy blunt object. The pattern of wounds indicated the use of a farming tool rather than a firearm or knife. Although the mattock was identified as the likely murder weapon, it was not immediately found at the scene. This absence raised the possibility that the killer had removed it or hidden it deliberately. Later, during the demolition of the farm, a mattock covered in dried blood was discovered hidden in the attic, confirming earlier suspicions. Investigators initially believed robbery might have been the motive, as entire families had been targeted in other rural crimes. This theory was quickly abandoned when a large amount of money was found untouched inside the house. Valuables remained where they had always been. Nothing of financial value had been taken. Evidence clearly indicated that the killer had stayed on the property for several days after the murders. Animals had been fed regularly. Food had been consumed. The fireplace had been used. This behavior suggested familiarity with farm life and a level of confidence that ruled out a random passerby. With no clear motive, police began compiling a list of suspects. One of the earliest figures to draw attention was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He had a complex relationship with Victoria Gabriel and had been involved in legal disputes related to the paternity of Josef Gruber. His actions on the day the bodies were discovered raised serious questions. Despite knowing that a murderer might still be present, Schlittenbauer entered the house alone. He unlocked the front door without difficulty, even though other doors had been found locked. A key to the house had reportedly gone missing days before the murders. Schlittenbauer also disturbed the bodies, further compromising evidence. Over the years, multiple statements attributed to him suggested knowledge of details that were not widely known. He was also observed visiting the demolished farm site years later and made comments about conditions that seemed unusually specific. Despite this, he was never convicted and successfully won several civil cases against individuals who publicly accused him of being the killer. Another suspect was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who had been officially reported killed during the First World War. Because his body was never recovered, rumors spread that he might have survived and returned secretly. Years later, unverified claims from former prisoners of war added fuel to this theory. However, fellow soldiers who served with Carl Gabriel stated they had identified his body after his death in battle, weakening the argument that he survived. Other suspects included the Gump brothers, who were linked to violent activities in other regions and were accused by a family member on her deathbed. Despite renewed questioning decades later, no evidence strong enough to support a conviction was found. Several farmhands and neighbors were also investigated, including individuals who had knowledge of the property layout and the location of tools. Some witnesses reported disturbing conversations, threats, or suspicious behavior, but none of these accounts could be proven conclusively. Strange reports continued to surface long after the murders. A farmer claimed to have seen two unknown figures near the forest on the night of the crime. Another passerby reported smoke coming from the farmhouse oven and described a foul smell. Years later, a stranger allegedly confessed to the murders before disappearing into the woods. None of these claims were fully investigated or verified. As years passed, the case grew colder. In 1955, the investigation was officially closed without identifying a murderer. Decades later, modern students and researchers reviewed the case using contemporary investigative standards. They criticized the lack of fingerprint collection and professional forensic methods, which were already known at the time of the crime. While these researchers reportedly agreed on a primary suspect, they chose not to publicly name the individual out of respect for surviving family members. Hinterkaifeck itself was demolished less than a year after the murders in an attempt to erase the memory of the violence. A small memorial now stands near the site where the farm once existed, yet the questions remain. Who killed the family? Why did the killers stay? And how did a crime so brutal remain unsolved for more than a century? More than 100 years have passed since the night 6 lives were violently taken at the isolated farmstead of Hinterkaifeck, yet the weight of that crime has never lifted from history. Time has moved forward, generations have changed, and the land itself has returned to quiet agricultural use, but the questions left behind by the murders remain as sharp as they were in 1922. Hinterkaifeck did not become infamous because the crime was loud or public, but because it was silent, controlled, and deeply unsettling. Less than a year after the murders, the decision was made to demolish the farmstead entirely. Officials believed that removing the buildings would erase the painful reminder of what had occurred there. The walls that had heard fear, the barn that had witnessed suffering, and the rooms where the killer lived, among the dead, were torn down piece by piece. Yet even in destruction, the farm revealed more of its secrets. During demolition, a mattock covered in dried blood was discovered hidden in the attic. This discovery confirmed the suspicions of investigators who had believed the murder weapon never left the property. A pocket knife was also found in the hay of the barn, adding another unanswered detail to an already complex case. Despite these discoveries, no new arrests were made and no final conclusions were reached. Near the former location of the farm, a small memorial was later erected. It stands quietly, marking the place where Andreas Gruber, Ksenia Gruber, Victoria Gabriel, Ksenia Gabriel, Josef Gruber, and Maria Baumgartner lost their lives. There are no grand monuments, no crowds, and no ceremonies, only remembrance and silence. Over the decades that followed, the Hinterkaifeck murders refused to fade into obscurity. Journalists returned to the case repeatedly, publishing investigative articles that re-examined the evidence and the suspects. Authors dedicated entire books to reconstructing the events and analyzing possible motives. Documentary filmmakers explored the psychological horror of a killer who remained on the scene after the crime. Each retelling revealed the same tragic pattern. Warnings were ignored, evidence was mishandled, opportunities for justice were lost. In 2007, students from a German police academy revisited the case using modern investigative techniques. Their work confirmed that the original investigators had been thorough within the limits of their time, but they also identified critical failures. The absence of fingerprint collection was highlighted as one of the most damaging oversights. Fingerprinting was already known and used during that period, yet it was not applied properly at Hinterkaifeck. The students reportedly reached a shared conclusion regarding a primary suspect. Out of respect for surviving descendants, they chose not to reveal the name publicly. This decision reflected the lasting sensitivity surrounding the case and the enduring impact it has on families connected to it. Hinterkaifeck has since become a symbol of unresolved justice. It represents the dangers of isolation, the consequences of ignoring warning signs, and the irreversible damage caused by investigative failures. It is also a reminder that not all crimes receive answers, no matter how deeply they are studied. The mystery has inspired fictional adaptations as well. Novels loosely based on the events introduced the story to new audiences across the world. Films and radio programs explored the emotional weight of the crime rather than its solution. Yet none of these adaptations replaced the reality that the true killer was never officially identified. For historians and criminologists, Hinterkaifeck remains a case study in missed opportunity. For true crime researchers, it is a reminder that truth does not always arrive with closure. For the public, it is a story that continues to provoke unease, curiosity, and reflection. The most disturbing element of the case remains unchanged. Someone committed 6 murders and then stayed. They lived in the house, they ate the food, they cared for the animals, they behaved as though the farm still belonged to them. This behavior suggests familiarity, confidence, and emotional detachment that few crimes ever display. It challenges simple explanations and forces uncomfortable questions about human psychology. Was the killer someone close to the family? Was the crime motivated by resentment, control, or long-hidden rage? Or was the truth lost forever in the chaos that followed discovery? What is certain is that the victims were failed long before they were murdered. They lived with fear, conflict, and danger that was visible to others, yet no effective action was taken. Hinterkaifeck is not just the story of a crime, it is the story of silence. This documentary is based on verified historical sources including court records, police investigation files, forensic summaries, and contemporary newspaper reporting. Primary reference material includes the Wikipedia article titled Hinterkaifeck Murders, investigative reporting published by Danach Courier and Süddeutsche Zeitung, archival documentation maintained by German Hinterkaifeck research groups, academic reviews conducted by German Police Academy researchers, analysis discussed in Case File True Crime Podcast, and historical research published in the book The Man from the Train by Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe history should be remembered truthfully and without distortion, and if you want deeply researched documentaries that respect both facts and victims, then your support makes a difference. Subscribe to Myth Vault now. By subscribing, you help ensure that forgotten voices are heard, unresolved cases remain examined, and real history is preserved with integrity. This is Myth Vault, and some mysteries refuse to be silenced.